Alex parked his car in front of the cabin, the last house at the end of the dirt road that disappeared into the dense forest. The place was enveloped in an almost palpable peace, broken only by the distant sound of birds and the soft whisper of the wind in the trees. The cabin, small and rustic, seemed to fit perfectly into the natural setting, as if it had always been part of the forest. He got out of the car, breathing deeply of the fresh, clean air. The city seemed like a distant memory, and the weight of the responsibilities of everyday life began to dissolve as he approached the cabin's entrance. Alex felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The desire to escape the pressures of modern life was strong, but the secluded environment had an aura of solitude that could not be ignored. The cabin was in good condition, although it had clearly not been used for some time. Alex opened the door with a slight resistance and stepped inside. The interior was covered in dust, but it felt welcoming. He began to unpack his things, placing his suitcases in a corner and packing what he might need for the next few days. After the initial cleanup, Alex decided to explore the cabin's surroundings. The grounds were larger than he had imagined, with trails that led deep into the forest. He walked a little, admiring the tranquil beauty of the nature around him, and found a clearing that seemed perfect for relaxing. The silence was profound, interrupted only by the sounds of wildlife. On the way back to the cabin, Alex noticed some strange marks on the wood outside, as if something had scraped the surface. He thought nothing of it, attributing them to animals. Back inside, he made himself some coffee and settled in for a quiet night. The initial discomfort was there, but the promise of peace and introspection was stronger. The first few days in the cabin were spent in relative calm. Alex devoted himself to organizing his thoughts and enjoying the peace he had sought. Mornings were filled with reading and walks in the forest, while evenings were peaceful, away from the city noise. However, the serenity began to be interrupted by a growing sense of unease. During the first night, while reading a book by candlelight, Alex began to hear a peculiar sound. It sounded like a distant whisper, as if someone were murmuring his name. He tried to ignore it, believing it was the wind playing with the leaves or a trick of his mind. Over the next few days, the noises became more frequent. Sometimes, it sounded like footsteps echoing through the cabin, even though Alex was alone. When he turned to investigate, he found only silence and emptiness. His mind began to question the nature of the sounds. Were they simply the product of isolation or something more sinister? On one such night, Alex woke from a restless sleep with the feeling that he was being watched. He got up and went to the window, where he saw a vaguely defined figure moving in the darkness. The outline was indistinct, but it seemed human. Alex's heart raced. But when he went outside to check, the figure disappeared into the gloom of the forest. Each night, the pattern repeated itself. The whispers became clearer, and the shadowy figures became more defined. Alex tried to remain calm, telling himself that solitude was affecting his perception. However, the discomfort persisted, and he began to wonder if the peace he sought was being replaced by something more disturbing. The journal Alex had brought with him was his only constant companion. He recorded the night's events and his interpretations, trying to find a logical explanation for what he was experiencing. But as the days passed, the feeling of unease intensified, and the line between reality and imagination began to blur. As the week progressed, the disturbing phenomena in the cabin became more intense. Alex could no longer ignore the sounds and visions that haunted him. During the day, the forest seemed calm and peaceful, but at dusk, the atmosphere changed. The silence that had once seemed comforting was now charged with an unsettling tension. One night, while trying to relax by reading a book, Alex spotted a figure in the shadows in the corner of the room. This time, the shape was clearer, a silhouette that resembled a distorted version of himself. The figure seemed to be in a state of agony, with an expression of despair and sadness. Alex felt a chill run down his spine and tried to light more candles to illuminate the room, but the figure continued to appear, disappearing as he approached. The nightmares began to become more vivid. Alex dreamed of scenes of failure and regret, times when he felt inadequate. When he woke up, the feeling of helplessness continued to haunt him. He tried to rationalize the dreams as products of his stress and loneliness, but the reality of the nighttime visions seemed increasingly concrete. One night, after waking up sweaty and panting from a particularly distressing nightmare, Alex found himself confronted by a sense of presence in his bed. When he turned on the light, he found nothing, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The visions of shadowy figures were now accompanied by voices, whispering words of criticism and doubt. Alex heard phrases like, "You'll never be good enough," and "Everyone has abandoned you," which echoed in his mind and intensified his fear. Confusion and fear began to dominate his thoughts. He wondered if he was starting to lose his mind, but the clarity of his experiences felt very real. The line between reality and hallucination was becoming blurred, and Alex struggled to maintain his sanity as the shadows and whispers became increasingly aggressive. Alex was in a constant state of exhaustion. The nights became increasingly unbearable, and the fear of the visions and whispers was as real as the loneliness itself. In a desperate attempt to find some kind of explanation or relief, he began to explore the cabin more carefully, looking for any clue that could shed light on what was happening. During one of these explorations, Alex found a hidden compartment behind an old bookcase in the living room. Inside it was a leather-bound journal, with the title Reflections and Regrets inscribed on the cover. The journal looked old, with yellowed pages and careful handwriting. He hesitated for a moment, but the need to understand what was happening drove him to open the book. The first few pages were filled with notes about everyday life, but as Alex continued, he began to find entries that reflected his own fears and insecurities. The diary's author described a growing sense of inadequacy and guilt, and the language was strikingly similar to Alex's own. The words in the diary spoke of personal failures, fears of rejection, and an overwhelming sense that he would never be enough. By the last entry, the writing became desperate and confusing. The diary mentioned something about confronting the shadows within and facing the reflection. Alex felt a lump in his throat as he read this, recognizing that the description applied exactly to the fears and insecurities he was facing. It was as if the diary was speaking directly to him, revealing that the cabin was not only a place of isolation, but also a cruel mirror of his own troubled psyche. As Alex read, a sense of panic began to take hold of him. He wondered if the diary belonged to someone who had been through the same emotional turmoil. He tried to focus on a rational explanation, but the visions of the figures and the whispers grew more intense, as if they were feeding on his growing anxiety. He knew he needed to confront what was happening, but the idea of facing his own insecurities in such a direct way seemed unbearable. The following night was the most terrifying Alex had ever experienced. He felt exhausted and desperate, trying to maintain his sanity as the disturbing phenomena intensified. The journal he had found seemed to be becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. The figures and whispers that had previously been merely annoyances now became an imminent threat. As he tried to sleep, Alex was abruptly awakened by a deafening noise, as if something was banging against the walls of the cabin. He turned on the light, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. He decided to get out of bed to investigate, his mind buzzing with the expectation of finding a logical explanation. However, what he found was even more terrifying. In the corner of the room, shadows stirred and began to form into several distorted figures that resembled grotesque versions of himself. These figures were moving, dancing, and contorting in a frightening manner. Alex tried to get closer, but the figures became increasingly aggressive, beginning to approach him with expressions of suffering and anger. He heard the voices from before, now magnified and distorted, shouting words of accusation and criticism. "You failed. You were never enough. Everyone abandoned you." The voices mixed with the sound of the figures moving, creating a chorus of despair that seemed deafening. Alex felt as if he were being overwhelmed by the intensity of the emotions and sounds. In a moment of desperation, he tried to fight the figures, but they seemed to pass through him, as if they were part of his own mind. The feeling of suffocation was overwhelming, and he felt like he was about to lose control completely. The cabin seemed to turn into a maze of fear, with every shadow and whisper enveloping him more and more. Finally, Alex managed to get out of the cabin, running through the woods in a desperate attempt to escape what was haunting him. The experience had left deep scars on his psyche, and he knew he was facing something that transcended mere illusion, something deeply connected to his innermost fears. The sun was rising when Alex finally emerged from the woods and turned onto the dirt road that led back to civilization. The desperate race away from the cabin had been the only thing that kept him sane during what seemed like an endless nightmare. Horror and despair accompanied him, making every step a challenge. By the time Alex reached his car, his mind was a jumble of thoughts and emotions. He was exhausted, his body shaking and his heart racing. The simple act of driving back home felt almost like a form of escape. The images of the figures and the echo of the voices were still fresh in his mind, and the feeling of panic did not diminish. When he arrived home, Alex tried to return to his routine, but the experience at the cabin had left an indelible mark. The tranquility he had expected to find had been replaced by a constant state of unease. He found himself constantly revisiting the events, trying to understand what had really happened and how to deal with the emotional burden he carried. As he spent his days trying to adapt to everyday life, Alex found himself at times when the feeling of being watched returned. He felt as if the figures and voices from the cabin were still with him, haunting his thoughts. Reality and illusion mixed together in his mind, making it difficult to distinguish between what was real and what was a figment of his disturbed imagination. At night, Alex would sit in silence, reflecting on what he had experienced. He realized that the true source of his terror was not in the cabin itself, but in the insecurities and fears he carried within himself. The solitude he had sought to find peace had become a cruel mirror of his own psyche, revealing deeper aspects of his mind that he had tried to hide. He began writing about his experience, not only as a way to cope with the trauma, but also as a way to confront his own inner shadows. The cabin, which had initially seemed like a refuge, had become a place of brutal confrontation with his own fears and insecurities. Now Alex knew that the real battle was to face the darker aspects of himself and find a way to reconcile these parts of his psyche with reality.